Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Faith Infused Leadership. I am Debbie Heiser, owner and founder of Three Vines Consulting and Leadership Development. And I really, as we look at this Faith Infused Leadership podcast, my goal is to come on and when I'm individually sharing, share some things that I've learned through my experience as a leader. And I don't know if I've really shared a whole lot of my background. I come from about 20 years of corporate experience, both with a domestic company for about 10 years and an international company for another 10 years, and then have gone into the entrepreneurial space and have worked with a partner down in San Diego in a business, and then also have started my own business back in 2016. And so currently I am in my business and loving every minute of it. And I work with private clients and help them in their businesses, whether that be that they are starting a business or in a current business that they're needing some help pivoting or experiencing some downfall in profit and want to scale or increase their profit. And then I also teach 2 classes at Gonzaga University. One is a servant leadership certificate program, and the other is a foresight and strategy class for the School of Leadership. And I absolutely love what I do. And I just want to share that part of this stepping into and feeling like I'm in the right vehicle now. I don't want to say I've arrived. That makes me feel like I've come to the pearly gates, but that I feel like I'm in the right vehicle right now is just through my experiences and helping people today. And I want to share some of those experiences with you. And so today I really want to talk about how silence really is the beginning form of listening. And I don't know about all of you, but sometimes I get pretty, I'm now not saying busy, but saying that I have a full life. I get pretty full and start just kind of running and running and running. And when I do that, it seems to be that the times that I allow silence in my life tend to start to disappear. And so I want to talk a lot about listening today and silence. And when we think about it, I'm going to talk just a little bit and give a little bit of teaching and then give some practical pieces for you to use as you go forward. And so really, I've always been intrigued that the words silent and listen have the same letters. And I think too that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. And practicing listening skills is so important, particularly when you're working with people. And I want to talk a little bit about 4 types of listening. Now, this came from Otto Scharmer from MIT, who does a lot of work in Theory U and presencing, and also from a good friend and mentor of mine who's been on a previous podcast, Dr. John Horsman, a retired professor from Gonzaga. And they talk about these 4 levels, and the first 2 levels of listening, when we talk about more of an academic look at it, are really within the boundaries of our own mental and cognitive organizational skills. And the last 2 really shift us from our own organizational skills in our head into the field, into our heart space, into that place from where the other person is speaking. So empathy also comes into play here. And so when we look at the 4 levels of listening, the first level really is about downloading information. And this is a little tricky too, because when you download, you're downloading through your own filter, and that filter is through your own experiences and your life. And so there are judgments that are automatically applied, some gross judgments, maybe some very subtle, based on that filter. And when you're talking about level 1 listening, that is where the situation occurs, where everything that happens really confirms what you already know. So it's, I know something, this is confirming, I'm taking it through my filter. There might be other messages in there, but I'm taking it through my filter to confirm what I already know. And then level 2 is really objective or attentive listening. And this is where you're paying attention, but also debating any confirming data. So something that's different, you're paying attention to what's different, and then wanting to come back with an answer to debate or discuss. Now, keep in mind, those are in our mental and cognitive ability. This level 3 is about empathic listening from within. And it's really a deeper level of listening. And I'm going to talk here in a bit about silence and how that plays into this deeper listening. But this is when we connect with our hearts, when we start to have some collective wisdom happening. We forget about our own agenda. We're not trying to think about what we're going to say next, but we're really about trying to see the world through others' eyes and really understand where they're coming from. And again, I think the key piece to seeing the difference is that you're not thinking about what you're going to say next, because when you think about what you're going to say next, you're not really listening. And then this level 4 listening is what we call generative listening. And that's really from source. That's where your intuition takes over, where we let go of what our preconceived notions are, what we may want to debate, what our filters are, and we're just open to what may come. And then as things emerge, we respond to what arises. And it's really an art because it requires us to have a deeper silence in ourselves. And it really requires us to slow down and slowing our minds down, hearing through the words, because usually there's other messages that come. We've all heard of active listening where you use nonverbal and verbal communication. This is much deeper. This is like a soul connection. This is where you're in a dialogue with someone and you can almost see and hear the words that they're getting ready to say. And so it's a much deeper connection. Now, all of these, well, particularly the last two, require self-awareness. And self-awareness also requires us to have empathy and compassion. And empathy and compassion are really evident when we are truly deeply listening. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you're talking with a friend and you can tell that they're not really listening to you. They're thinking about something else, or you've been talking to someone and ultimately it feels like they're one-upping you on everything, or that everything you say is a debate, which is your adolescent, by the way. Some of you have heard previous podcasts where I talk about transactional analysis and how your adolescent is the one that's always arguing. And those can be pretty exhausting conversations. But really, where the empathy and the compassion are evident is in this empathic listening and the generative listening. And being a part of a cohort that we meet every other week for 2 hours and do this generative dialogue and generative listening, it's really interesting. And Zoom actually through COVID has been a blessing because it's allowed some additional silence that normally when you're in a room with someone doesn't always take place. We had a pretty in-depth conversation about that because I don't know about you, but when I've been in a boardroom or been in a conversation or a meeting, what ends up happening is people start talking over each other. They want to be heard first, and not always, but to get into this generative dialogue, it's about slowing down. It's about not being uncomfortable in the silence, which really, let's go into that here in a minute. But when we look at this deeper listening, it's really about, I mentioned this earlier, but having that deep awareness about ourselves. Now, how do we find out more about ourselves? And, many of you have probably heard this before, but getting into a practice of doing meditation. And I would say 10 to 15 minutes because it takes a few minutes to actually get into that space. There are plenty of great apps out there. I use one that's called Centering Prayer. I really like it because it asks you to focus on a word. So I'm looking kind of in my forehead when my eyes are closed in my third eye, and I focus on a word, and it for me has prayer involved in it. And You choose what sound you want to happen and how long you want to meditate. Otherwise, what happens is I start to squirrel out and I worry what time it is, and then I pick up my phone and I want to see what time it is. I also recommend to people, if you use an app on your phone, to turn your phone on airplane mode so that you don't get an interruption sound with an email or a text message come through, or even the buzzing if it's on silent, because ultimately that takes you out of your meditation. Excuse me. Um, and so when we're listening deeply, it's about having this empathy. And empathy, there's a really good Brene Brown, like 2.5 minute video. So I suggest you to Google Brene Brown empathy video. But ultimately, empathy is feeling with people. And in order to do this, I do have to listen really deeply. And sometimes that's focusing on not only what's being said and the words that are being said, but the body tells a message. Someone can say, I'm not angry, but they're sitting like this and they're shaking or shaking their foot or moving or having fists clenched. So a lot of times watching those nonverbals. And then also it's about listening to what they may not be saying, because sometimes, well, let's think about this. We live in a world where you ask people, how are you? And most of the time you hear the answer fine, when probably 90% of those people aren't fine. They either have something really heavy on them, or they want to celebrate something, but they don't say anything about it. So sometimes it's hard to trust what people might be saying, but we can also read between the lines. Now, it's really important not to judge, because we can come to a quick judgment based on our own filters of something that's not being said that may not have anything to do with it. So you have to be a little careful with that. But part of it is not only with what's not being said, but really being attentive to how they're thinking, what they're thinking, how they're potentially feeling, and how they're communicating. And then also, when I look at empathy, I have to look at validating the other person by communicating understanding and care. And this really requires a verbal and nonverbal congruence. Now, I'm not talking about codependency, where I feel like I have to validate the other person, but when we are in a deeper listening and the generative listening, it's about lifting other people up. It's about validating people. It's about investigating. It's really about a lot of curiosity that takes place. Curiosity to me is one of the best pieces of being able to have a dialogue, and as long as we're listening and not trying to figure out what to say next. So that's where silence really comes into play, and really transformation happens in the pause. And I want you to think about, if you're a business person and you've been in a meeting, how many times have you been in a meeting and people speak up right away? Or even you. I know I used to speak up right away in a meeting, and it's so much better to sit back and be the third or fourth person to speak. It gives you context about what's happening. It allows you to bring forth more wisdom, and it allows you to really synthesize what's happening in the meeting, so that your response is something that comes from a different place than just a quick response. So when we talk about pausing and we talk about silence, there are really 4 things I want to share with you in regards to ways that you can practice silence. Excuse me. I skied a little bit this morning, folks, so that must be where the yawning's coming from. Anyway, we want to practice silence by meditating. I talked about that earlier, because really when you're quiet, and again, peace is finding peace in all the chaos, but finding a quiet place. I love to go into nature and do some meditation. But it allows us to then start becoming aware of ourselves at a deeper level. And if you go out into nature, there's so many messages that come from nature. And so even just taking a hike and really concentrating on potentially what's emerging for you, or like what message you need to hear today, and then using your senses to see and hear and feel and smell what's out there. And it's amazing what divine downloads can happen when you're out in nature as well. But we don't all have the capability of doing that. But having some time every day to slow yourself down and really center yourself. And I will tell you, this is becoming a much wider practice, even in corporate. I know I was at a conference a couple of years ago where the CEO and of Cliff Bars was talking about how he had a meditation room off of his office. And if that meditation room door was closed, no one was allowed to come in until he was done meditating. And that he meditated at least once a day, if not twice. And so I can't iterate the importance of it either. And I know I can tell when I'm not meditating. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes that's the first thing to fall off. And when that happens, I'm not centered. I'm not as quiet. And when I say quiet, as I go about my business, I'm not tapping into source, or for me, God. I'm not tapping into and listening to my own self and my own body. Um, so I also mentioned being the third or fourth person to speak in a meeting. That's a way too that you can practice silence. Sometimes I will put my hand over my mouth as a cue for myself not to speak up first. So figure something out for yourself and try it. And then also notice your comfortability with that. Did you feel really uncomfortable when you waited to give your feedback, or waited to insert something into the conversation? Or were you the first one to speak? That is something that I'm working on, is trying not to be the first one to speak, in full disclosure. The other thing too is to pause before you speak, and to pause before you provide feedback to people. Because again, it's about not planning how we want to respond, but rather pausing to gather our thoughts. Because if we're planning what to respond to, usually that occurs when you're having the conversation. Where if someone asked me a question or they finished their point, it's okay to pause for a few seconds and then state what I want to state. Now, I understand there are times, and I've been in these conversations too, where if you don't jump in, you won't be heard. But I promise that what I've seen happen is that people that do pause, they do eventually and are able to articulate what they wanted to articulate. And usually it has a much stronger impact than those folks that were jumping in to make sure that they were heard. And the last one is really learning to embrace silence. And people do get very uncomfortable with silence, but practice some of this. Ask a question. I can't tell you how many times I see people, and I do this too, where we ask a question, and before the person has a chance to respond, we're already answering it for them, and many times giving them a multiple choice answer versus just being quiet and letting them think and come up with an answer. So I challenge you over the course of the next couple of weeks to really take these 4 items and try to do some meditation. And don't go 0 to 100. Maybe try it once or twice a week to start out with, until it becomes something that you just is a non-negotiable for you. Try to be someone that doesn't speak up first in a meeting, and really be conscious of how that makes you feel. And then pause before you speak, and also making sure that you're pausing and letting other people speak, and letting other people answer the questions that you're asking. So silence is super important. Listening is so important. And I think particularly in the world that we live in today, I know there's many times that I get frustrated when people talk over me, when I'm trying to convey something and they jump in and try to finish my sentence for me. And please understand, I'm mirroring what I also have been known to do. I get very frustrated when I'm in the middle of speaking and someone interrupts me to bring across their point before I'm finished. I find too that listening in this new technology world where we're texting or calling and leaving I still call and leave messages sometimes. But when you text someone and you don't get a response for multiple days, that to me is not silence. That's a frustration because I don't feel listened to. I don't know if someone heard me from the text message. So those are just some examples. And again, I would challenge you as you go forward to really think about where and how you're listening. Are you at the first level or the fourth level of listening, or somewhere in between? And then how you can use silence to your advantage. And so thank you for listening. This subject is near and dear to my heart. And if you want to learn more about how you can work with me as a private client, or I'm getting ready to launch, or by the time this goes, hopefully we'll have launched my group program, helping people transition. And it's called Leveling Up. And so be on the lookout for that. But feel free to go out to my website at www.3, and that's all spelled out, THREE, V as in Victor, consulting.com. Or you can follow me at Debbie Heiser out on Facebook or Instagram as 3V Consulting. Thank you so much, and everybody have a fantastic day.